want to start by this question. So, what is activity-based working? When we ask this question, people often confuse it with terms like flexi space, co-working, hoteling, or open floor plan. It is a concept that is usually referred to as a workspace strategy, maybe with some innovative technology that supports people working there. So people naturally start to think about the floor plan as the key to activity-based working. Now I want you to take a step back and look at this chart on the left. What is missing from this floor plan? What is the critical component that everything is designed to support? I'd like to have you to type your response in the chat box. It can be just a single word or some short comments, nothing complicated here. People, behavior. Yeah, exactly. It is the people who work in the workspace and the underlying culture which defines where and how people do their jobs. Activity-based working is more than just a physical space. It is a way of working where people can choose where they work, when they work, how they work, and with whom they work, based on the activities they need to perform. Physical space and technology are important components, but they're merely the options provided to people. It is the culture that determines people's ability to use the physical space. In our past ABW client engagements, we've seen various levels of success when companies transition into activity-based working. We know anecdotally how some of the shifts happened. For example, we usually see people reporting higher sense of productivity and more collaboration. And companies who focus more on the intangible aspects of ABW tend to achieve more positive outcomes. For this research project, we want to know exactly what are some of the patterns in people's reaction to activity-based working? Where does ABW work and where doesn't it work? And what contribute to a successful activity-based working transition? To set the foundation for us to answer those questions, first, we need to know what measurable impact does activity-based working have?
We started with a research into existing literature, and here's just a glimpse into our experience into the research process. So one study from 2004 found that for a Dutch municipality, a move from a cellular office to flexible space correlated with a drop in productivity. The same researcher studied a Dutch financial institute and found the opposite, where a move into a more flexible space actually enhanced positive perceptions. Another study in 2017 of a Swedish insurance company tried to uncover the impact of activity-based workspace through a longitudinal study. But out of the 100 employees who participated in the relocation, they were really only able to collect 34 responses that are pre and post matched. And they came to the conclusion that the relocation had no effect on productivity, but there was an increase in satisfaction. Fast forward to the summer of 2018, when a study from two professors at Harvard Business School raised a ruckus in the US, using data collected from sociometric badges and employees' digital communications. They found that boundaryless open floor plan offices were related to a decrease in face-to-face communications, which was then replaced by electronic interactions. Many reporters at that time cited this research as the nail on the coffin for open floor plan offices. But boundaryless open floor plan does not represent activity-based work environments necessarily. So we looked closer, and one such study suggests that within their sample, the most reliable predictor for satisfaction in activity-based environment was a preference for this type of environment prior to the move. Activity-based flexible offices did not do so well in supporting focused demanding tasks, but for them, the impact on communicative tasks was unknown. If any of you had tried to investigate the impact of activity-based working through a review of empirical research, I'm sure your experience is similar to ours. Previous research shares a lot of useful guidelines, and we're very grateful for what we're able to learn from them. But a lot of them are limited by mixed outcomes, small or smallish sample size, A lot of the studies were conducted in Northern European areas, mostly because activity-based working had been a concept more mature and more widely implemented in Northern European countries. And lastly, not enough pre and post comparisons. So we came back to the drawing board and thought about our research question again. Um, what do we have that the typical researchers may not have? And we really reflected on some advantages that we have. We tend to have longer term engagements with our clients, which offers more opportunities for pre and post comparisons. Our projects do vary in sizes, which offers additional perspective. We have quite a bit of a global coverage when it comes to our projects. To expand on that. And lastly, we do have quite extensive knowledge of what happens in between the pre and the post, which is helpful in lending us additional insights into what may help to explain the data. So with that, we made a slight tweak to our original research question by adding transition. So now our first question became, what measurable impact does activity-based working transitions have, with a focus on what is the change that this transition is bringing to organizations. As Robbie said, we partnered with Leesman in the past 7-8 years to collect data from our clients about their workspaces. And over the course of our partnership, we've gathered nearly 100,000 individual responses. But because for this research, we were most interested in the impact of an activity-based working transition, we narrowed our database by 2/3 and focused only on 29 matched projects. A word about the selection criteria. These 29 projects, which is the equivalent of 58 surveys, were selected carefully based on 2 important criteria. The first is that they must have matched pre and post surveys of roughly the same demographics. And the second is that the architectural design must reflect the basic activity-based principles, which means that the physical space has at least some differentiation in the settings for different activities. If it's a straight up open floor plan, it's excluded from this sample. And with that, we ended with still about 32,000 responses in total, with 19,000-ish counting toward the pre-move surveys and roughly 13,000 responses counting toward post-move surveys. And this sample still gave us the perspective of spanning across 11 countries, 23 regions, and 16 different organizations. So let's start by looking very quickly at the first, one of the first analysis that we started to do. We plotted these 29 projects, their pre's and their posts, on a chronological axis on the bottom. And on the vertical axis is what we call the overall workplace impact score, which is a composite of employees' agreement levels with several statements about the workplace. And we normalize that score to a 0 to 100 scale to make it more intuitive and easy to compare with other constructs that we'll talk about in a short while. So a few patterns already emerged during this first comparison. When we just look at the average, the post-move scores, which are shown in the teal bubbles as well as the teal line on the screen, they're higher than pre-move scores, the orange ones. And when looking at the aggregate, on average, we see about a 17% increase on overall impact post-transition. We do have more post-move data in later years and more pre-move data on earlier years of varying sizes, but size does not always correlate to scores. We do notice, though, a few of the high posts, especially if you look up towards the right-hand side of the screen, tend to be relatively smaller in size. And what that tells us is that smaller projects may have higher possibilities of achieving better results. The one thing I do also want to point out is the range. We see quite a big range for both pre-move scores as well as for post-move scores. Now, the big range for pre-move scores was not surprising because we know that people, join in activity-based working from various different pre-move conditions. It could have been private offices, it could have been open floor plan, and people could have been really, really happy or really upset with their workplace to begin with. But the range that exists in the post-move survey was a little bit of a surprise for us. We then looked a little closer at several of the sub-dimensions of the overall impact score, starting with productivity indicators, and found very similar patterns. So the survey asked individuals to rate on the Likert scale on two statements related to productivity. One is the workplace enables me, hence the individual productivity, to work productively. And then for the team productivity, it's the agreement with a statement that goes, the workplace enables us to work productively. And when we were looking at the average, which are represented by the middle dots on the lines, we noticed the improvements just like before. And at first, we were very happy with this because to us, it shows that we're doing the right thing as organizations are transitioning into activity-based working. On average, the employees have felt they've been able to be more productive, and quite impressively so, actually, especially for the individual productivity. And we see similar things for two other subdimensions. So the workplace has a positive impact on organizational culture, had on average 11% improvement on the scores, and sense of community also increased a bit. And while we are celebrating, I think, the high scores that we see in the post-move surveys, we are bugged by a slight uneasiness related to the range. It's the similar pattern that we've seen across these subdimensions as well as in the overall trend. And that left us wondering what really happened here. So we added a second question to our next phase of exploration. How do activity-based work transitions differ? And what could be behind the differences? What can we learn from high-performing ones, and what stood in the way of the ones that are not doing so well?
This question brings us to this table of projects with their change in overall impact scores. As you can see here in the highlighted column, the change in overall impact score has a large range from -10 to 33. There are organizations that achieved great success, while some others had negative experience with activity-based working transition. To show how activity-based working transitions differ for these organizations, we group the top 25% together and call them the LEAP projects, with LEAP indicating high improvement in overall impact, and the bottom 25% labeled as STEP, indicating minor or even negative improvement. This grouping method allows us to compare the two groups and isolate factors that could have contributed to the high improvement of the LEAP projects. Based on our experience with activity-based working, choice and flexibility are the critical factors contributing to a successful activity-based working transition. Choice is about the match between employees' work style and the support they receive in the office. We're interested in which work activities are considered important and how well are these activities supported. Flexibility, on the other hand, assesses how flexible or mobile employees are when they work in an activity-based office space. Do they switch work settings based on activities? Do they have adequate support to work in a mobile way? And what are some other factors that contribute to internal mobility? Our research project provided answers to most of these questions. And here are the 7 major findings we've discovered. And I'm going to just walk you through them. When we look at the perceived importance of activities, we observe that the ratings are similar across LEAP and STEP projects and before and after the activity-based working transition. The top 3 are always individual desk-based focus work, planned meetings, and telephone communication. This shows us that activity-based working doesn't fundamentally change how people prioritize their activities. But one trend we see here is that post-change importance ratings are relatively lower across the 21 activities. One possible explanation is that people had a better understanding of the activities in the transition period, So now they're able to provide more accurate ratings afterwards. We then compared people's satisfaction of support received for the activities between Leaps and Steps projects. And here we can see a difference. So for the LEAP project on top, we observed improved satisfaction in most activities, especially for the ones related to social interaction and well-being. STEPS results are more mixed. Satisfaction after the move is very similar to the pre-move baseline. For the three activities that did not show positive impact are learning from others, spreading out paper, and using technical equipment. They're highlighted in the graph. The lower satisfaction for spreading out paper is expected, as activity-based working is usually parallel to organization's digitalization initiative. And on the other hand, using technical equipment, on the other hand, it's more job specific and also related to the technical aspect of the equipment. We also found interesting results when comparing leaps and steps results on the impact of workspace on culture and sense of community. For the impact on culture, both leaps and steps reported positive impact of a workspace on culture before the transition. We can see here steps scores are higher compared to leaps. Through the transition, leaps project achieved a 37% improvement from 54 to 76. But for steps, there's actually a drop in score from 66 to 60. A similar pattern also shows up when we look at the impact on sense of community. This again illustrates the big variation in how activity-based working shows up for different organizations and the importance of investing in culture, which brings people together and create a positive feeling around working together. Now, after culture and sense of community, let's switch gear and focus on flexibility. Internal mobility is a typical representation of flexibility in the workspace. We adopted these 4 levels of mobility when conducting our analysis. So level 1 is the least mobile, with people performing most of their activities at a single work setting. As we start to move down the ladder, we'll see more and more switching from one work setting to another according to the activities. And at level 4, people would use multiple work settings regularly, and they basically never base themselves at a single work location in the office. By looking at the aggregate data, so we're talking about all the projects here, we see that before activity-based transition, about 80% of people are in the less mobile group 1 and 2. After the transition, there's a shift in mobility distribution. We can see more people start to switch work settings as there are more people in mobility level 3 and 4. For mobility level 4, the percentage of people even tripled after the transition. Now we've seen how the distribution of internal mobility shifts after activity-based working transition. We'll take a deeper look here at how people benefit from being mobile with activity-based working. Before moving into activity-based working, looking at the yellow lines here, we don't see a clear pattern of the relationship between mobility and the overall impact of the workplace. After the transition, a positive correlation starts to appear. The correlation is especially stronger in the lead projects on the left. Apart from the fact that all 4 groups reported higher overall impact scores, the more mobile people get, the more likely they report positive experience in activity-based working. When we look at STEPS project on the right side, all mobility levels reported lower overall impact scores. Mobility level 1 showed the biggest drop, suggesting that people who are not used to switching work settings struggle the most in activity-based working. When we change the y-axis and look at the relationship between mobility and productivity, the same pattern shows up again. And here it's worth pointing out that even in lead projects, people who are not able to switch work setting and take advantage of the workspace suffered from productivity loss in activity-based working. It is clear at this point that internal mobility is a predictor of success for activity-based working. But we're curious about what are the factors that contribute to internal mobility. Activity complexity is one of the factors that are usually associated with people's ability or motivation to switch work settings. In our analysis, activity complexity is the number of activities people consider as important out of the 21 activities being considered in the Leesman survey. When we plot overall impact scores against activity complexity for all projects, we can see that after the transition to activity-based working, looking at the blue or teal line here, there is a positive correlation between activity complexity and overall impact. People with higher job complexity tend to have more positive experience compared to people with less job complexity. But does it mean that activity-based working is just not for people with lower job complexity or just with less need to move around? Not necessarily. We can find some clues here when we look at the mobility and complexity together. On this chart, the 4 vertical panels are the 4 mobility levels. And for each panel, the x-axis is the activity complexity. Overall impact score is the y-axis. And again, we've broken down the chart into leaps and steps, with the leaps on top and steps at the bottom. When we look at the 2 less mobile groups on the left, there isn't a clear relationship between activity complexity and overall impact. This suggests that when people are still desk-bound and don't take advantage of work settings being provided, people who juggle multiple roles would be just as happy as those people whose roles focus on less activities. When we look at mobility level 3 and 4 on the right, there is a similar pattern to the previous chart. So people with higher activity complexity tend to benefit more from activity-based working. But I want to point out a nuanced observation here. So when we look at the top right corner, even people with low activity complexity could achieve high mobility in activity-based working and enjoy the benefits it brings. They can simply benefit from switching from one desk to another, supporting the same activity. The change of scenery or just different people they encounter could help them feel refreshed and maybe come up with new ideas. At last, we come to age. It is commonly believed that older people does not adapt well to activity-based working, possibly because they're just more attached to the desk-bound way of working. Our finding is partially in line with this belief. We observed a negative correlation between age and overall impact, with the 55 to 64 age group showing minimal improvement, and the 65 or above group showing a big drop in overall impact after the activity-based working transition. But older people, they're not doomed to feel miserable in activity-based working. By breaking down our projects into leaps and steps, we can see that in the leap projects, older employees reported improvement in overall impact. Although the benefit is less significant compared to the other age groups, this shows that activity-based working is not always a burden for older employees. With proper change management process in place, they can just enjoy their work styles just like their younger colleagues. To summarize what we've talked about, we've seen perceived importance of activities consistent across groups before and after the activity-based working transition. But the level of support for these activities are much higher in LEAPS projects compared to the STEPS projects. There's also a difference when we look at the impact of a workplace on culture and sense of community. LEAPS projects showed improvement, but STEPS didn't. When we look at flexibility in the office, both LEAP and STEPS projects became more mobile after the transition. Internal mobility is positively correlated with overall impact and perceived productivity after the transition, especially for the LEAP projects. Role complexity as the extra layer we added in our analysis, it does not predict satisfaction alone. Both complexity, I think both complex and less complex roles can benefit from activity-based environment when using this space in a flexible way. And the last piece here, age predicts dissatisfaction only for STEP projects and not for the LEAP projects.
And that made us wonder what the LEAP projects are doing right and what do they have in common. And we took a look at a few more analysis and came up with identified a few common challenges and looked at how LEAP projects really addressed them. So typically for our LEAP projects, to address the challenge of employees not using the space as intended, they tend to really adopt an approach of shaping the layout with users through co-creation. For us, involving users at the concept development stage and inviting them to learn from the process really helps to give them the assurance that their voices are heard. This not only provides an opportunity for the designers and the leaders to get input from the users, but also gives users an opportunity to appreciate and discover for themselves the best way to use the new space. Changing the ways of working also requires addressing people's personal attachment to what it was before. So in addition to traditional transition management, successful projects also tend to invest in thorough process to help users, to guide them through the detaching and reattaching process. We often advise our clients to start driving changes in ways of working way in advance of the space transition. Guiding employees, for instance, to co-create agreements in the shared space so that people are more motivated to adhere to etiquettes that they define for themselves. And invite employees to consider the trade-offs that are involved in the decision-making of a really tough project so that they can build a deeper understanding of how we arrived at the conclusion of new ways of working. One very commonly reported reason for why employees continue to work desk-bound, even in an activity-based environment, is that their perceived cost for switching settings is very high. And part of what contributed to that is the decisions related to the design and implementation of the virtual environment often prioritizes cost or timeline and not the user experience. So when designing the technological infrastructure to support activity-based working, we believe it's critical to consider how employees' needs are met now and how work will evolve in the new way. Treat users really as a dynamic element within the environment and provide ample amount of support to ensure that whatever has been implemented can be used by anyone in the organization, not just your help desk magicians. And lastly, an essential task for managers and leaders alike in times of big transitions, role modeling a culture of trust and empowerment. Activity-based working assumes a very high degree of autonomy and empowerment. If there isn't enough trust within the organization, even if you have a space designed for activity-based working, people may refuse to really work in that way. It is therefore very important for organizations to build skills and abilities at the leadership level to enable them to role model new ways of working. The initial research project started around this time last year, and we set out to find answers for those who are looking to rethink their office spaces and how people might show up in the office. At the beginning of this year, a pandemic happened, and it created a lot of uncertainty and fear for us, and it created also many transformations that we witnessed. Starting the end of March, we heard about a rotation of buzzwords going from Zoom fatigue to the new normal to work from home is here to stay to the office as we know it is dead. One of the biggest change that we see to our day-to-day life since the onset of the pandemic is how we work. Many surveys have been conducted and many more are still in the process of gathering responses. And I'm just sharing with you a sampling of statistics from a handful of reports that friends and colleagues have shared with me in the past couple of weeks. Overall, when it comes to statistics related to working from home, we know that pre-COVID, some organizations and individuals work from home more, some less, but on average, we were at about 30%, roughly about 30% for some organizations have people working from home at least one day a week, or they have that option. The projection for post-COVID, depending on how the question is asked and how the responses are aggregated, you may get very different numbers, but on average, we see about maybe half of the survey population wanting to work from home as much as possible, and typically over 75% wants to be able to work from home in the future, at least 1 day a week. Now, these stats do tend to shift as we progress in our experience of working from home for everyone. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see some of these move in the next couple weeks and months. But at this moment in time, what this has drove us to think is this transition in the pre-COVID world was something that we thought was only thinkable for the most progressive organizations. It is now becoming part of our shared vocabulary. And when we consider choice and flexibility now, in the future, there will be really an enhanced focus on the remote component. I know so far our research had talked a lot about internal mobility and demonstrating the relationship between internal mobility and various organizational impacts in the activity-based work environment. And some of you might ask, but how do you have internal mobility when you're working at home? Equally in a post-COVID world or even with COVID world, internal mobility in the short term may become undesirable because people are afraid that it might spread germ. So how do you ensure that a space still has a positive impact? How do you ensure that employees can still benefit from activity-based working? It was honestly a little bit confusing to us as well at the beginning. We thought about, maybe, when you work from home, you can try to switch from the living room to the study and maybe bedroom another day and see if that helps to change anything. And what we realized from our mini experiments at the very beginning was that the concept of internal mobility does not apply the same way when it comes to home environments. Some of us are lucky to have a dedicated space to work at home, but many of us are sharing spaces with others, a working spouse or partner, roommates, children who needs to do virtual homeschooling, family, or your fuzzy friends. And what we realized was that we had been, for some time, taking the concept of internal mobility almost too literally. Switching settings does have its benefits. You get to exercise a little bit. You get the shift of the scenery, and you get to exercise different muscles in your brain. But it's not the switching itself necessarily that drove the success of LEAP projects that we observed. It is very possible upon reflection that internal mobility really is a reflection of how much choice and flexibility there is within the organizational system. So we started a brainstorm of what choice and flexibility had been about in the future and what they are going to be about in the future. We'll share our initial reflections with you through 5 sets of considerations, and you're more than welcome to share your ideas, your thoughts with us as well. And I'm sure this will be an evolving piece that we continue to build on. So the first thing that stood out to us was thinking about in choice and flexibility for us in the past, in the pre-COVID world, had mostly been about providing a variety of work settings in the office. And we often have these conversations with architects, with designers, with project team members in the organizations to figure out how can you ensure that you have the right mix of settings to support different activities in the office. In the future, we're going to see that in addition to that consideration, for some groups, for some individuals, teams, or organizations, home or remote work might become the default, and your consideration will need to expand to cover that. In the past, we also focus a lot on ensuring awareness and abilities among our users, employees, to use optimal settings for work tasks. In the future, that consideration once again expands beyond the building itself, and it's likely to expand beyond the work hours, especially when you're considering that without the geographical or co-location restriction, your talent pool can really expand, which will then introduce new conflicts about how does it work to work in different time zones and work during different work hours. In the past, one of our, I think, biggest challenge in encountering in our process is to really convince or try to persuade our stakeholders that sharing should be set as the defaults in a activity-based work environment, to nudge the campers to even mobilize a little bit so that they get to experiment or experience different settings for different activities, rather than just thinking, oh, I have to do all of my work in this one place. In the future, we don't see that as much of a battle for us anymore. We really see sharing will naturally become a outcome of new ways of utilizing spaces. Environment now has mostly been optimized for real-time collaboration for in-person and for virtual settings, as it's quite evident in how we've considered the various types of collaborative environments that we tend to design in office spaces to include both the in-person and virtual components. In the future, there will still be an emphasis for real-time collaboration, but also a more intentional piece on the connection part. What we are seeing is a lot of organizations, given this period of time, have started to think, how can our teams collaborate better with each other asynchronously? And how can we really give individuals that empowerment and freedom of choice to do that? And what we what we believe is going to happen in the future for especially the more progressive organizations who have dared to start changing their ways of working, is some of the real-time collaborations might get replaced by asynchronous collaborations. And when people do come together, whether virtually or face-to-face, it will be much more intentional, and it will focus a lot more on the connections. Lastly, on mindset and behavior shifts. In the past, a lot of our focus had been on educating and coaching leaders within organizations to really, how can you manage mobile teams well, and how can you instill trust in that process, how can you manage about outcomes. In the future, we see that that will still be a focus for some organizations, but on top of that, what will be added as a additional layer would be deliberate and inclusive decision making, which is once again super critical in really creating a trusting environment that truly can enable individuals to make choices for themselves. With refreshed thinking on choice and flexibility, we also revisited the success factors for LEAP projects. And despite these projects taking place in different organizations with different priorities, cultures, and values, they achieved success within activity-based working because they followed similar processes in the development process. And when we think about how to define or create the new normal for our organizations, this user-centric approach becomes even more important. Instead of shaping just the layout with your users, you now have the opportunity or the task to shape new ways of working together with your users and employees through co-creation. COVID-19 really did a lot for us in helping people to detach from their previous ways of working. But what we can really harvest from this process, and really important to take away from this process, is what are some ways of working that had already been changed, the positive changes that we want to preserve as we emerge from this crisis. This is now is a better chance, better opportunity, and better time than than ever to start work the way you want to emerge from the crisis. When it comes to technology and policies that reduces friction, I invite you all to think about how your organization or organizations that you work with have really rapidly shifted in the past couple of months. Consider how employees' needs were met before and how that's been done now. What are some paperwork that got shifted into digital ways? What are some processes that got simplified in the process in this transition? What lessons are we learning from this rapid ramp up that was considered impossible pre-COVID? And I think most importantly, celebrate these moments and these wins, and think about how these can be applied and replicated as we emerge from this. And lastly, the task for leaders and managers. We actually did not even change a word for this one. Role model a culture of trust empowerment. And what we realized is that for a lot of organizations, a transition in their ways of working with ABW had been a big change. That's why role modeling this particular culture of trust empowerment had always been so important. And now it becomes even more important. Um, we realize is that not all great leaders in this crisis were medical experts, but every great leader focused on building an enormous amount of trust empowerment. And it's precisely that that helped organizations to become more resilient and even able to thrive through this crisis. So we're approaching the end of our presentation. This was our very first effort looking through the huge amount of data that we've accumulated in the past years. We learned a lot from this project, and our research, just as many research that we've come across before, is not perfect. Ours is not an empirical study, and what we have shown are correlations of raw data and not causations. For this research, because we wanted to scale, we also had to forego data for many projects that we knew were interesting, but where the data were incomplete. But that led us to more curiosities to explore new questions for our next research efforts. A few things that we have already started to think about are related, for instance, to activity-based culture. We're very curious about if there is a concept of activity-based culture that could be alive in organizations. If so, what might be constituting that? And what could drive a shift towards activity-based culture? We're curious about how might we influence the degree of flexibility and choice in the organizational system. We've learned about internal mobility in the past being one of the most tangible elements to hold on to as a lever for influence, but we're equally curious about what else can we do to influence that. We're curious about the longitudinal effect, the long-term impact of activity-based working on people's mindset and behaviors. Some of our projects have been conducted and completed over 10 years ago, and it would be really, really interesting to revisit what are some artifacts from this ways of working shift that have been preserved in the organizational system. And lastly, how will this time of everybody working from home change people's perception about the workplace and work itself? We welcome you to submit your ideas, your questions in the chat. If your question is something that we can answer now with the research that we have already done, we'll be happy to answer that, and Julian will help pick up that question. And if it's a question that we are also curious about, then I thank you in advance for sharing your brilliant idea with us, so that we may carry that with us into our next research effort. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Robbie. That was a wonderful presentation. Lots of questions coming up, few on the research and a lot on how to move forward from the research, especially in the post-COVID world. The first question we'll go with is, what are the differences in design and process between the LEAP and STEP projects? And what major mistakes did you see in the STEPS projects?
Robbie, do you want to start with the LEAP step differentiation?
Yeah, sure. I think some of the factors, I think Zoe have already talked about in the recommendation section, right? So these are the things that LEAP's project had done well. So engaging users from the beginning, right? Inviting users to attend work sessions and design the layout and figure out what is their way of working. And then based on that to build their workspace upon that. I think for sometimes in the steps project, the users are engaged in a much later time. So the architects would work with the leaders only. And then based on their inputs, the office space is built. And then after those employees move in, they just suddenly find out, okay, this is not what I expect at all. And I don't know how I would work in this space. So yeah, this is a critical factor for us. Zoe, do you want to add more?
Yeah, yeah, I would say when we were doing the first round of screening on the note about our architectural design principles, following activity-based principles. So when it comes to design considerations, um, I would say the biggest difference probably lies in how well there is a match between the physical settings provided and people's actual work patterns. And because I think when we were selecting leap and step projects, we really focused on screening by the delta, by the change that happened. So a lot of the changes were actually reflected more so in the process of how things are done, and not yet directly immediately clear in I think in our existing data. I would add that in our actual full version of the white paper text, there are 3 case studies at the very end, and all 3 are examples of LEAP projects. So that's our opportunity to share a little bit more sort of a peek behind the curtain to see what were the processes, what happened to really make that difference.
Wonderful, thank you. And you will all be receiving that white paper by email tomorrow, I believe. The next question is, what about external mobility? We talked a lot about internal mobility. Can you say something about external mobility and its impact on activity-based working?
Ravi, do you want me to take
Yeah,
that?
I think when we look at the data originally, so when we look at external mobility, so for the LEAP projects, actually there is people tend to come to the office more often than they used to. So there is actually a drop in external mobility, probably because now that their office space is much more attractive and they find out their collaboration or individual focus work is more effective there. And the trend is reversed for the steps group. So they're more likely to work in other locations at client site or at home or just off campus. And we suspect this is because the office space doesn't provide a good match between the activity and the physical settings. So it just basically just make the office space less attractive for them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Go ahead.
Zoe, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, one comment. So I think previous research, one of the previous research we came across showed that in their study, there is a positive correlation between internal mobility and external mobility, which when you think about ways of working, people who don't show up to the office that much might be less attached to a desk. Intuitively makes a lot of sense. So we're a little surprised when we first found out how it showed up on our data. So that's something we would be definitely interested in investigating more in the future as well.
Wonderful. We're sort of segueing here into the COVID questions. One of them is, now with working from home, do you see work from home or the home office being another setting to consider in the many settings of dealing with activity-based working when designing offices?
Absolutely. I think within the industry, there are lots of discussions that have started to happen about who within the organization should be responsible for considering the home office setup, right? And I think at the onset of the pandemic, I noticed a lot of organizations, teams, or managers within their teams proactively started to look for resources on, hey, here's an ergonomic guide, here's a video to teach you how to really set up ergonomic settings at your home office. So that started to happen, I think, out of necessity at the beginning of the pandemic. What's going to happen more in the future is that the home office will become a more legitimate consideration for the whole design process. It may be it could be part of a HR benefits package to consider the home office setup as being part of that, or it could be a design option to be considered together with the facilities department. So I think there's a lot of debate now about how that responsibility is going to work out in organizations in the future, and it may also differ from organization to organization. But I think, yes, for sure, the answer will be that home office is going to become a legit option, legitimate alternative in the future.
Great, thank you. The big question about COVID is twofold. One is about shared space. And I know that there's newer and newer evidence that surfaces aren't really the biggest passer on of COVID, that it's more through the air and in unventilated spaces. But the question is, how will activity-based working and even the perception of sharing change now? And then the second question with COVID is, what do we do differently in the ways we operate, not just the physical space, but in how we implement and live activity-based working in terms of culture and ways of thinking and mindsets to adjust?
Yep. It's interesting. I think these two questions are somewhat related, or to me, the answers are somewhat related in a way that I'm not a medical expert here, so I will not share. I really don't know enough about, I think, how the germ, how the virus is staying on surfaces and all that. But I think what we realized from this research and also combing through findings during the pandemic was that activity-based working is way beyond the physical space. And the physical space is merely designed to support a way of working. So in a way, you can do activity-based working even without the physical space. I think taking it really to the extreme. And that's sort of a, I think, a realization that came to us when our team had to all start to work remotely during this time. And we found that we're still organizing our day-to-day with the activity-based lens through it. So I think in the future, there will probably be even more intention focused on that activity-based thinking. And how do you organize your day? How do you organize your work environment through this lens? So I think sharing, to me, falls in that category of, is that, you know, not to share because you need to share, but sharing merely as an outcome of how the space will be utilized in the future. And can you remind me the second question again?
The second question is more around activity-based thinking and activity-based culture, how COVID is not just changing the space, but changing the idea of work and the idea of how we live our lives around work.
Yeah, I'd say one example I am seeing right now in the recent client engagement is the tremendous shift in how people have thought about ways of working. I think in the past, when we consult our clients or advise them on their activity-based working journeys, a lot of times we encounter this resistance that really came out of a place of the fear of unknown. So at the time, people were afraid of, I don't know if I can, you know, fully manage my team remotely, or I don't know if I can really, you know, start to work productively if I cannot find my colleagues all the time. So there were a lot of fear in the past related to that uncertainty. This pandemic had really pushed everyone to just try it out. And for a lot of people, they've discovered for themselves that, hey, you know what, it's actually not that bad. Hey, I actually enjoy not having to commute several hours a day. And I actually have been able to connect with my family better. I've been able to achieve better balance. And you know what, productivity actually increased and people actually started to work a lot harder. So for us, that was, I think, a surprising, maybe not so surprising, a really nice impact that happened with this forced experiment that's brought about by COVID-19.
It's a great example. Last question before we wrap up is from Kristen, and I thought you might find it very interesting with both of your psychology backgrounds in industrial and organizational psychology, which is, what about onboarding to ABW? How does that work from the HR new employee perspective? How do we get someone into the ABW culture?
Yeah. I think in the short term, there might need to be a lot more focus on how to do that very intentionally virtually. It's possible. It's hard. It will require a lot more effort and I think intentionality. You can do that by setting up these induction meetings to really get your new employees to meet with everyone, or as many people as possible within your organization. It's sort of artificially trying to create the connections that would otherwise be more natural in a face-to-face environment. So I think that's sort of the consideration and the challenge that organizations will need to face in the short term. In the long term, though, I think what I've been hearing so far is also that for a lot of people, there is something about a shared identity that they felt much more in touch with when they're in the physical office space. So I feel like in the future, certain activities will still be better supported in the office, and employee onboarding and orientation, as an example, might fall into that category of activities best done in the office, because I think once again that face-to-face component, that personal connection, is just so valuable to be done in person.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Robbie and Zoe, for the lovely presentation, and thank you all for your insightful questions. To wrap up, I hope you all enjoyed the presentation and you found our research enlightening and enriching. We certainly think it's quite exciting. If you're coming away from this session inspired to take an activity-based approach to your organization, there are a number of ways you can work with us. The first step would be to take a scan of your organization to see how you are working now and examine how you were working before COVID. This will tell you what possibilities are for your organization going forward. Velatone & Company employs a number of data-driven instruments for this, which help you get real-time feedback so that you can adapt appropriately to the rapidly changing world. If you are interested, please reach out to your appropriate geographic contact pictured on the right. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you will receive a link to the recording in the next couple of days. The full white paper will be sent to you as webinar registrants in the next days. For the slide deck, this is available for now to our customers only, but please reach out for appropriate geographic contact to obtain a copy of it. For more on insights in the future of work, check out our website or follow us on LinkedIn. Please do not hesitate to reach out if you would like to connect. I hope you all felt energized and inspired by today's discussion and that you take at least one piece of insight you can apply to your own organizational strategy. Thank you for joining and have a lovely day.